Well, good day to you, ladies and gentlemen, from all over the world tuning to this webinar organized by the Ukrainian World Congress. My name is Zorisa Lutsevich, and I am the head of Ukraine Forum in London-based Chatham House. We are really pleased that we have such a high-level expert audience today, and also the panel that will obviously analyze the situation in view of the imminent escalation and possible further encroachment on Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty by the Russian Federation. Ukraine has been a lot in the headlines of global media. There has been a lot of diplomacy going on to de-escalate situation. Obviously, at this point of our meeting, the diplomacy has led to little results the way I see it. And Russia keeps on building military presence around Ukraine with exercises in Belarus and additional deployments of its sea fleet in Black Sea. So there's a lot of question, of course, about different steps that Ukraine can take, that its allies can take, and trying to understand how this alliance can work in a cohort and concerted manner is key. So Ukrainian World Congress is the global organization uniting Ukrainians, and it's running active information campaign to explain what is going on in and around of Ukraine and what is happening to the European security architecture. The campaign called Stand With Ukraine, hashtag Stand With Ukraine, is one of the most popular hashtags on Ukrainian Twitter right now. And you feel free to share any information that you hear today from our distinguished panel also on Twitter. This event is available in 2 languages. And if anybody would like to listen to the webinar in Ukrainian, you can choose it in the language function on the Zoom. And you choose Ukrainian and you'll be able to watch it in Ukrainian. It's also live stream on Facebook. So I would like to just now welcome our panel, and I will start with Pavlo Grod, who is the president of the Ukrainian World Congress, our host, who also served as the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress that unites over 1.4 million of Ukrainian Canadians. Pavlo, over to you to say your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Orysia, and welcome everyone. I especially like to welcome and thank our distinguished panel of friends. It's amazing that we continue to build a very strong coalition of friends of Ukraine. And so a pleasure to be speaking with you today. And most importantly today, I think there's an opportunity. We've all been inundated with lots of information about what is happening in Ukraine. And we put together this panel really to talk about Ukraine, the real view. And these are people who, quite frankly, speak very frankly. And I think this is what we really need today, is to speak very frankly. We see from one side, on the government of Ukraine side, they're trying to be careful. They're trying to not create internal instability. They're trying to manage their various stakeholders. They're trying to avert an all-out war. And so, they're a bit more challenged with what they can and can't say. And we're constantly in communication with the president's office, the various ministers of foreign affairs and defense and others. And so we understand the difficult position they're in, but it's really up to us, especially civil society, to really provide the real view. And that's why we chose this topic today. We as the Ukrainian World Congress have a network of member organizations in 65 countries around the world. And just over the last few days, I've been in communication with over 30 of our member countries, where we're talking to them about what is happening in their respective countries, whether it's Sweden, whether it's Bulgaria, whether it's the UK. And it's very fascinating to see how different countries view Ukraine and what they're prepared to do and where their minds are moving to. And that's really important, is to help them get to where they need to be. Whether it's Canada finally deciding to provide defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine, or what's going to happen in Sweden. Which way are they going to go in terms of their push to perhaps move towards closer NATO membership? And so we're seeing a very dynamic geopolitical situation. Not to reiterate what we, I think, all very well know, Ukraine is on the front page today. We see Russia's military buildup, their increasing rhetoric. We're seeing a unprecedented level of high-level diplomatic contacts. Just yesterday in Ukraine, there were 3 prime ministers of different countries that visited Ukraine. We've seen a real strong move in terms of supporting Ukraine. And I think what's really important is, listening to some of the Ukrainian pundits talk about, the current situation in Ukraine and, what has changed. Some are saying, well, nothing has really changed since 6 months ago. What has really changed, regardless of how you look at the troop movements, but what has really changed is the way that the world is looking at Ukraine today. And that is something that the Ukrainian leadership really needs to take into consideration, is that Ukraine is on the front lines, and finally, the world is learning about what has been already going on in Ukraine for the last 8 years. And I think this is an opportunity for Ukraine to get the concessions that it really needs and has been asking for, which is basically peace. What we need to make sure that we don't have is the opposite doesn't happen, is that Putin doesn't use this situation to extract further concessions against Ukraine. I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts on the Minsk agreements, whether that, after the last Normandy discussions in Paris, we all thought that Minsk was dead and that the agreements had no validity anymore. Now it's being brought up again. So what's the
Ja bez
future?
kamery, ja tylko napiszę swoje.
One thing I certainly would like to do is focus on a couple of key issues here in my introductory remarks. Number one is the Ukrainian World Congress and the global Ukrainian community will not be playing down the threat of Russia. I think it's very clear that the threat is very real. It has been very real for the last 8 years, and it's becoming increasingly more severe and more real. We're finally seeing that that Ukraine is the victim here, and it's become clear to the international community that there's no civil war here. This is Ukraine being a victim of Russian military and foreign influence. The next is we're going to be calling on the people of Ukraine to look up. Not to be afraid of looking up. We need to be able to see that there is an imminent threat and be prepared for that. Not to create panic, and I think the Ukrainian people are resilient today that they will not panic. It's important to emphasize to Ukrainian allies or to Ukraine's allies why we need military equipment. And I've been listening to many debates in various parliaments, but it's very clear that and I'm always amazed how Western governments are still debating this. I mean, Ukraine is outgunned from a person-to-person 4-to-1. When you look at some of their air and other defensive, they're outgunned 15-to-1. Providing international support also introduces the element of surprise, and I'm sure the general will talk more about this as well. And we need to be very clear, and Ukraine needs to be very clear on what they're asking their allies for, because we often hear that. My last point here is, let's talk about the realistic scenario. In 2014, the GRU, the Russian Special Services, organized separatist movements in Donbass and in the oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk. They tried in other oblasts. And this is something that we need to make sure that we highlight and shine the spotlight on, and ask whether the Ukraine's local governments are ready and prepared to put down these foreign agents supported by the fifth columnists. We have to look at the very realistic scenarios, not be afraid to address them, that Russia may attempt a small land grab. And how are we prepared to respond to that? Let's be very clear on how we're prepared to respond to that. Will they take on a full annexation of Donbass? If so, what does that mean? And then what are other risks to Ukraine's sovereignty? Because the military aggression is only one tool of a very sophisticated hybrid war that is going on and can potentially escalate in Ukraine. So on that, I will conclude my introductory remarks and welcome everyone else's participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavlo. I mean, I think it's great that you are calling us, in a way to look beyond the headlines, because I think, we may be missing an important trends or priorities that Ukraine and its Western partners should be addressing right now, being in a way hijacked by this psychological blackmail also that the Kremlin is both putting on Ukraine as a society and wider Western cohesion and unity as such. So, ladies and gentlemen, you are free to post your question in the Q&A chat. We will be collating them together by topic and bringing back to the panel. And now I would like to move to the next speaker who is able to join us from Kiev, and that's Pavlo Klimkin, the very experienced Ukrainian diplomat who served for 5 years as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who's also been an ambassador to Germany, but now he is the program head at the Ukrainian Institute of the Future. And Pavlo really combines that knowledge of understanding how Western alliance works with Ukraine, the global geopolitical shift that is taking place globally, but also the role of Ukraine in it potentially, regardless of, you know, Kremlin's plans, because I think as long as Ukraine has that real view and vision, Ukraine is stronger. So Pavlo, over to you.
Thanks, Arisa. Hi, everybody. It's good that we are not talking political messaging here. We actually don't need it. It's the same way we don't need just awareness of what's going on around Ukraine. We need to create emotion. You know, there is a educated guess. We need to create educated emotion, because what's going on now and the reaction by the West and all kind of concerted efforts are, of course, going beyond what we had before. But it's not in any way a drive for being happy, for being satisfied, because we have to go beyond, fundamentally beyond what's going on now. More military assistance is good. More political support and more and better declarations are good. A kind of economic support is also important. But let's have a look what Putin has in mind. And for me, it's about two things, just about two things. One of them is purely geopolitical. It's about to reshape. He's about to reshape current geopolitics and to adjust it to his view and how he believes geopolitics or real politics. He believes that the system of rules should be fundamentally adjusted and structured or shaped in the spheres of influences. Or better to say influences, priority influence and dominant influence or dominancy. What is the difference to have a say, to have a final say, and to have the only say? Let me oversimplify it a bit. But the second point is definitely Ukraine. He would like to focus on Ukraine, and key points he raised with the US in his negotiations, or better to say Russian-US negotiations, is not just about NATO membership, because he does not believe in any guarantees. He actually himself broke any sort of guarantees, including legally binding ones in our bilateral agreements, not just Budapest Memorandum. So he does not believe in guarantees. He does not believe in all kind of stuff around NATO. But what he needs is simply to put on hold any sort of military and security related cooperation between Ukraine and the West. Anything, infrastructure, training, everything. The second point, he would like to push for his crazy version of the Minsk arrangements and basically to impose it on us. But the last and the most important one, and it's critically important to understand, he called us not Ukraine, but anti-Russia. He actually denied us any sort of right to have our history, language, statehood, everything. Basically, he believes Ukraine is artificial in any sense. So he he would love to have a direct and indirect influence on our not just foreign, but especially internal policy, in order to prevent us being how he put it in his mindset, to stay as anti-Russia. It's his fundamental goal. So don't get it wrong. It's not about Minsk arrangements, Donbass. It's about Ukraine, and the stake is Ukraine. It's about our way to the future, or back to the Russian Empire, or to get split by Putin and by the Russians. He clearly understands he is able now to take up initiative, and actually he was quite successful. But the U.S. reaction was really important, and I believe so far quite okay. But we need more. We definitely need more solidarity. But we also need something really mind-blowing to support Ukraine. And it's not just about more military assistance. It's about two things, and the moment is there. It's about security guarantees, and it's about a kind of economic assistance in the sense of Marshall Plan. Let me stop here, and it's not about myself playing with definitions. You are all, educated folks, but I would love to go beyond what is going on currently, and to start fomenting, getting support for something which is far more ambitious. And I would simply stop short of saying what kind of options I see for Putin in the nearest future. We have been here. And he has just agreed to provide his guidance, military guidance for us in the case of emergency. And I'm serious, Ben. We are ready for that. We know you, so it's probably up to you to talk about military options. And I would love to have a chat about hybrid/military options in further discussions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pavlo. I think that's very important, this point that Putin is really trying to arrest Ukrainian nation building project, because, you know, nations, as we know, they don't just emerge overnight, and Ukraine has been going through a quite expedited nation building project, especially after the annexation of Crimea and the way society felt where it belongs. That revolution happened in Ukraine that is lagging behind in the West, where Ukraine belongs, where the region belongs, and a general lack of ambition, I would say, of united Europe, even United States, for Eurasia at large. You know, there was that notion of Europe for whole and free. It seems like we are settling to the low common denominator of where that Europe whole and free should stop. So I like that of us thinking more strategically about that. But since General Hodges was mentioned already, I'm very pleased to bring him on. I think he can deploy the total defense spirit, and maybe there will be a foreign legion, who knows? Just as a matter of joke, because this will be in public domain, obviously. But General, you are now holding the Pershing Chair in the Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, that is Washington-based. You are based in Germany currently, but your last military assignment was as Commanding General United States Army in Europe. So you know that footprint US security has on prosperity of Europe, something we forget, that the transatlantic unity gives that security umbrella that allows Europe to be a prosperous economy and democracy. So where do you see how Ukraine can address these predicaments as it has been described by Pavlo? And is Kiev's strategy right? Is Western strategy there? Over to you.
All right, so thank you very much for the privilege and to see some friends. And I don't know if everybody in Ukraine appreciates or understands how lucky they are to have somebody like Pavlo Klimkin who has worked so hard for his country and represented Ukraine so well. I did just have the privilege to be in Kiev from Sunday midday until early yesterday morning. So I've got a few things that are fresh in my mind that I would like to share, recognizing that being there for just a day and a half does not make me an expert on everything that's going on. So I'm going to be sharing impressions of what I saw. I had the privilege to, as part of a delegation, to meet with several members of the Rada from different parties, as well as the speaker of the Rada, with the different ministers, and the privilege also to have a office call with President Zelensky, and also talk to some Ukrainian officers as well. I came away impressed with the spirit, both from the president as well as other people, of determination to fight. I didn't get a sense from anybody that, this is not worth it, we're doomed, let's roll over and avoid. I mean, zero, nobody anywhere that I talked to. And one of the coolest things is how aggressive Ukrainian media is. I mean, this is such an important part of any vibrant democratic society, to have an aggressive, active media. And I think this is something that Ukraine wants to sustain. But I left the president's office confident that he is not confused about the threat. I know that there has been disagreement between the White House and President Zelensky's office about how to convey or portray the threat. For sure, he is not confused about the threat, the seriousness of it, nor are any of the people in his administration. The difference, of course, is what does the threat, how will it manifest itself? Is it going to be a massive assault of 100,000 Russian troops coming across the border all at one time? Or is it going to be something that is that looks different? And in my view, I think what we're going to see is a continuation of what's happening right now. Obviously, cyber, obviously disinformation, obviously sabotage. I know that Ukrainian interior forces have captured over the last 2 weeks several different groups of saboteurs coming from Chechnya, Transnistria, and from Belarus. So, I mean, they've captured them already. So we know that this is part of it. We know that there's a lot of capability that is in place along the borders, and with the Russian Navy converging more capability. But I think, in my view, what we're going to see is limited objectives, aimed primarily at the coast, the Black Sea coast, and the coast of Azov, because number one, that means less casualties for the Russians. Number two, it means that they can stay below a certain level, a perceived threshold below which it will be difficult for some European countries, I think, to go through with these massive sanctions. I mean, just for example, if it's just a part of the Black Sea or the Azov coast, then I'm not sure everybody in Europe would say, no, max sanctions, everything, SWIFT, everything. So I think that also will cause them to think about a lower level, and also the sustainability. I mean, this will be very difficult, and especially as they go deeper into Ukraine. I tell you what, I would not want to be a Russian truck driver in a convoy providing logistical support for a Russian BTG, because they will not survive. Ukrainian resistance will be very, very tough. Now, I do understand that the president's office is very concerned about the economy and the amount of financial resources. You can't ignore that. And I'm pretty sure that part of the Kremlin's desired outcome is to see Ukraine's economy crushed, to see the finances drained, just to keep the hryvnia afloat. So this is also why I think it's more likely limited objectives that would isolate Ukraine from the Azov Sea and the Black Sea, to further damage the economy without having to have 100,000 troops go deep into Ukraine. From a practical standpoint, 100,000 is nothing, actually. I mean, if you're talking about large scale, massive ground operations, it will take a BTG a battalion tactical group of 800 soldiers just to clear and secure one of these massive apartment buildings or hotels in downtown Kiev. I mean, that's fighting in cities takes lots and lots and lots of soldiers. And there'll be lots of casualties. So I don't believe they have the capability to even attack Kiev, let alone seize it or clear it or encircle it. I think they would be hard pressed to do that in Kharkiv. Odessa, of course, they can do that without ever going in there, just by completely blocking access from the sea. So that's why I assess it the way I do. Let me make, I think, 3 more points, and then I will stop so that because I do want to hear what everybody else is saying. Of course, you know, today my president announced troop deployment of several thousand American soldiers that had already been alerted. They're going to be coming to Europe in the coming days. I don't know the exact timeline. Most of these are soldiers who were America's contribution to the NATO response force. Most of them will be going into Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, which is very interesting. The bulk going to the Black Sea region, not to the Baltics, but to the Black Sea region. I think this is very important, and it signals a recognition of that this is where the threat is. Second point I'd want to make is, and Pavlo, you referenced it a little bit, the whole information domain where we are competing, this false narrative. I live in Frankfurt. Unfortunately, there are still too many people here in Western Europe that are willing to accept some of the fairy tale about who the aggressor is, why we are where we are, and why it's so important that we continue to push back on who the aggressor is. I did see some movement in the last 3 days. The co-leader of the SPD, which is the leading party inside the coalition German government, Lars Klingbeil, said Russia is the aggressor, and that if there's another attack, everything is on the table. They still have a hard time saying the words Nord Stream 2, but when the co-leader of the SPD says everything is on the table, I think this is a positive step in the right direction. And for sure, the 3 senior members of the Green Party, Mr. Habeck, Ms. Baerbock, and Mr. Omid Noripur, they are very tough. And I think that they are pushing the German government to accept more of a role. Let me conclude by saying on the idea of guarantees, NATO has been guaranteeing the borders of the Soviet Union since 1949. Soviet Union's borders were never under any threat since 1949. And at the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was at its weakest, not one NATO vehicle or soldier stepped foot or violated Russian sovereignty. So somehow that NATO was a threat is a total fairy tale, and we need to all continue to push back on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Hodges. I think it's critically important that you point us to the threats coming from the Black and Azov Sea, because that is often omitted, you know, in understanding how actually Ukraine is encircled by Russian build-up, but also, you know, from the north, what is happening in Belarus, and that is another possible flashpoint where, you know, in the spirit of keeping, you know, deniability, there could be a proxy use of Belarusian armed forces to encroach on Ukrainian territorial integrity. But I think these are all scenarios, tactical scenarios to achieve exactly these strategic objectives we were talking about. And economy is key here. I mean, we already see European Union having to commit 1.2 billion euros in microfinancial assistance. Yesterday, UK government pledged another 2 billion pounds. And this is already the price of that military buildup and the cost to Ukrainian economy. It cost Europe there, you know, to support Ukraine, and much more will be needed in the coming months. So the task is quite overwhelming for all of us. But without further ado, I would like to invite Peter Dickinson, who is the editor of the Ukrainian Alert blog that is run by the Atlantic Council. It's a great resource if you're not subscribed yet, to get quite a lot of voices actually from Ukraine, what is happening on the ground. I can't, you know, advertise it more. I think it's very interesting collection of essays that Peter curates, but also, Peter has been living in Ukraine for a very long time. He knows Ukrainian public space, especially journalism. And as we were talking about this hybrid threats, disinformation is one of them. So it'd be interesting to hear, Peter, from you, how Ukraine is bearing and under this torrent of disinformation. Is it effective? Do you see Ukrainian society becoming more resilient compared to 2014? And where do you see still risks? So Peter, over to you.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, Alicia. Thank you for having me, and hello to all my esteemed fellow panelists. Yeah, I think you're right. I think Ukraine, the current crisis over the last few months has demonstrated Ukraine's increased resilience as a society. I mean, I think there are some technical issues that are reducing Russia's ability to influence Ukraine from within in terms of information politics. But I think Ukrainians are getting a lot more savvy. They've learned a lot over the last 8 years. They've become smarter to disinformation tactics and information warfare in general. And there's a striking amount of determination, I'm also noting, from people who are ready to stand up, who are obviously, nobody welcomes the threat that the country is currently under, but there is a strong sense of resilience, there's a strong sense of defiance of people saying, well, we're not going, we don't want to surrender to this, we want to defend ourselves and defend our choices. So I think it's been quite encouraging from a domestic point of view in terms of Ukraine's response to the threat. Of course, the government's messaging in terms of don't panic and let's not overplay this has created some uncertainty, especially internationally, when people say, well, hold on, if Ukrainian government says this, should we be more alarmed than as alarmed as we are? But I think that's understandable. I think the Ukrainian government is here looking out for the long-term destabilization factor that Russia is playing, and they're looking to prevent that. They're looking to prevent not only the losses we see economically at the moment, but they're looking further down the line, in terms of Ukraine's ability in the future to continue to attract investment and to attract financing, to secure insurance for Ukrainian businesses, etc. So the Ukrainian government's position, I think, is understandable, and the Ukrainian society's position, I think, has been very commendable and has been very encouraging. I would also be quite optimistic about the international response. There are issues, as General Hodges has discussed, the German position, and we're all aware of that. And I think Germany is not alone. It should, I don't want to be too harsh on the Germans alone and just single them out entirely. There are a lot of countries, I think, in Europe who are hesitant, who are not thrilled about the idea of going deeper into a confrontation with Russia, but still there is a broad consensus that this needs to be done. We have seen very strong positions adopted by the usual suspects, if I may say so, the Baltic states, Poland, countries that know very well what Russian imperialism means. We've also seen Britain take a very strong response. I think Ukraine in this sense perhaps is one of the few beneficiaries of Brexit, dare I say it, in that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has seen in Ukraine an opportunity to underline the fact that Britain is still a force to be reckoned with on the international stage, and Boris Johnson is notoriously a very big fan of Winston Churchill, and I think in Vladimir Putin, Boris Johnson thinks he's found his Adolf Hitler, and he's found his character he can stand up to and rally against in the cause of democracy. So that's be that as it may, Ukraine is a beneficiary of that, and the UK has been very supportive, and will continue to be by all accounts after yesterday's visit. The support that the UK is offering is very, very, very strong and positive. America, of course, has been very positive. Canada has increased its support recently. So I think internationally the response has been strong. If Putin was looking to see if there were any chinks in the armor, if there were any weaknesses, if there was disunity in the West, or if he could divide the West, I think the answer is no at this stage. Yes, there are certain weaknesses, but fundamentally the West is pretty determined and has probably done more than we would have expected. If we'd have looked at this, going back 5 or 6 months, probably we wouldn't even expected the level of support that we've seen. my concern would be now to look to the future. So my current outlook is quite optimistic, given the circumstances in terms of the way Ukraine and the international community have responded so far. But I would say that we need to try and look to build on this now and look further into the future, of how we're going to get over this whole geopolitical confrontation, because it may be that we'll be here, in a month or two, it will become clear that there's no big invasion coming, or it may just drag on endlessly with the deployments of Russian troops close to the border. But whatever the outcome of this current crisis is, the bigger picture, the problem of Vladimir Putin's commitment to undermining Ukrainian independence will remain. This is something that I'm seeing more in the international community, a greater awareness of this. Although Putin has very consciously tried to redirect the crisis towards NATO expansion, towards the idea of it being an American or a Western issue, I think that a lot of the media has not bought into this. They recognize that this is all about Ukraine, essentially. The Russian officials have said quite openly on a number of occasions, and Putin, in fact, said yesterday, more or less, when he was speaking with the Hungarian president, Urban, the West has not responded to our main concerns, which are Ukraine. So it's all about Ukraine. I think that's clear to most people now, and most people are becoming increasingly clear in the international arena that Putin has really got as they say, he's obsessed about Ukraine. He's got a bee in his bonnet about this. He won't let it go. And he understands that if Ukraine is allowed to progress down the current trajectory towards Euro-Atlantic integration, towards a more democratic, market-based, liberal, open, pluralistic society, it will potentially be disastrous for his own regime. It could potentially be the end for his own regime. And it would also mean the end for his claims to have been a great Russian ruler. His entire legacy will be in tatters. So this is really, I think the stakes for Putin personally cannot be overstated. This is a hugely important thing for him. I think international audiences are starting to understand that more, but we need to then make the next logical step and say, okay, well, we need to resolve this question decisively, or we're going to be here forever. I mean, sometimes I'm at events in Kiev and they're always, they're very interesting, but I sometimes think, we're having the same conversations today that we were having in 2014, 2015. We get over the hump of a crisis and then we sort of relax a bit and then it comes back again. And then we have the same conversations, and the pendulum swings a little bit and knowledge gets a bit better and we move a bit further forward and Ukraine gets a bit stronger. But fundamentally, we've not moved that far from where we were 8 years ago. And that's worrying, because are we going to be here in another 8 years, having moved a little bit further forward? I think we need to start talking about fundamental changes in approach. And I think that means, first and foremost, we understand the West is not going to fight for Ukraine. That's clear, but Ukraine will fight for Ukraine. I have no doubt about that at all. Ukraine is more than capable of fighting for Ukraine. Let the West arm Ukraine more. That's one. But also the West needs to fundamentally embrace Ukraine and get beyond the current sort of subsistence level aid when Ukraine needs it. The EU sending money now because the Ukrainian economy is battered. Okay, great. That's welcome. But the EU should be sending much more money and much more aid, much more support, all the time. They should be looking to transform Ukraine and not standing back and saying, well, we'd like to see a bit of this and a bit of that. They need to take the initiative, and obviously they're not going to be comfortable doing it militarily, so let them do it economically. Let them come in here and transform this country, because that's the only way where we'll get to a position where Ukraine will be like a very big version of the Baltic states, not necessarily in NATO, not even necessarily in the EU, but so clearly integrated into the Western world and so clearly prospering from it, that the idea of Russia being able to influence Ukraine with anything other than a full-scale invasion will no longer be a realistic proposition. Until we reach that point, unfortunately, I think we're going to be coming back to these same these periodic crises again and again.
Yeah.
With that, I end the sermon.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think it's very commendable, your desire to push us to think strategically how this tension and this incompatibility of objectives between the Kremlin and the rule-based transatlantic security order can be reconciled. Maybe not reconciled is not the right word, but cohabitation for some time until the possibility of more inclusive European security, and realistically what can be done with the Kremlin that is, with the current leadership in the Kremlin. And I think that I would like to maybe come back to the panel with one question, because of course, many of you argued it has been a lot about Ukraine, and it's an existential, democratic Ukraine is an existential threat to Putin. And possibly even there is a fear of disintegration of Russia. That is why they need an expansion to what they believe belongs to them as the sphere of influence. But if that is the case and it's all just about Ukraine, then what's in it for our Western alliance? Maybe each of you can say whether you really see this just about Ukraine, or you really see the NATO and US also seeing that it's about them, that Putin has a bigger ambition to either humiliate the West, to compel them to get out of Eastern Europe, and to basically carve himself a seat at the global table with China and US. So bullying Ukraine gets Putin a seat at the table. And this is where Ukraine is becoming also a tool, not just an objective of this whole struggle. Or you could kill two birds with one stone. But maybe if you can reflect on that, why the threats of Russia to NATO and transatlantic unity? Maybe we'll start with Paul and then go to Pavlo.
So what's clear, thank you, Odysseus, for that question, because I think this is important to put in the context of why it matters. And in speaking to international media, often they ask, so why should it matter to Canada? Why should it matter to Sweden? And I think we have to understand that Putin is playing a longer game here in terms of his attempts to expand his influence and his control over things like natural resources. And using the example of the Arctic and his northern neighbors, and the threat that he potentially poses to Canada in the north, to the US in the north, to the Northern Atlantic or those Northern European countries. And that continuous aggression we see Sweden and other countries facing. And I think that's a key message that we also have to deliver, is that because Putin hasn't been able to make a success out of his economy through innovation and through other services, he's doing that and supporting his regime through natural resources, and his attempt to try to continue to expand his ability to tap into natural resources is really a key strategy. So I think it's important for us to ensure that other countries feel that this aggression that seems to be for some halfway around the world is really something that is impactful to them. And I think that the world is finally starting to see that. And again, just to restate an earlier point, is that the world, maybe things have not changed over the last 8 years in terms of Russia's aggression towards Ukraine, but what has changed is the world has finally stood up and taken notice. And it's also important for the world to understand that this is not, these conflicts are not just in Ukraine. This is not just an invasion directed at Ukraine. We have the frozen conflict in Moldova. We have the frozen conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, which recently got escalated. We had a challenging situation in Kazakhstan, in Belarus. Internally in Russia, we have potential ethnic republics being created. We have the liberal Democrats that will rise up. So this has the potential, if all those peace-loving people around the world in those regions in particular are prepared to stand up, that will be something that will see the end of Putin's imperialistic ambitions.
Thank you, Pavlo. Now over to Pavlo Klimkin in Kiev.
I see the Western reaction and the Western efforts. Let me be clear here and quite straightforward, as actually more of the same. We have definitely more military assistance, it's important. We have more declaration and statements. Again, important. We have more visits in Kiev. Now we have so many visits, the people are focused on just on visits. We have definitely more of the same. But do we have something qualitatively new in the sense of the Western answer? We have some bits at least of sanctions which are qualitatively new. We know about them, but at the same time we don't know about them publicly. We yes, somehow we know from different sources, but in the public domain, for many people, for Ukrainians, is just about more of the same. It's not just people started fearing Russia or just getting afraid of Russia. But it's really time and to do something proactive. My point, firstly, more of the same is not an option anymore, and the sooner the West gets it in its mindset, the better. Second, the West has been proactive all the time, reacting to Putin's escalates. Any kind of them, whether it's military in different regions or hybrid. For me, it's time to get proactive, to really get proactive. Otherwise, the West is under threat, not only Ukraine under threat. The third point, it's time in a hybrid sense, of course. Don't get me wrong. To start getting the fight over to Russia. If Russia, attacks us in a hybrid way on our territories, whether it's energy or cyber or disinformation or whatever. So why not to start comprehensively in a really good coordination among all allies to start addressing Russia with the same way. Of course, you could say it's all provocative, but at the end of the day, just recall what was happening in 1948. While the Berlin blockade, if the U.S. decided it's all just provocative for Stalin, so what would be happening there? Maybe it's not the best example, but simply to say we are so provocative, we can't agree on the lowest denominator, so let's stay more of the same. It's gonna be difficult for Putin. It's gonna hurt him, but it's not enough because Putin has a very rational mentality, but it's his rationality. It's not our rationality. And on the top of that, which is also quite important to understand, I said at the very beginning, maybe teasing up a bit, but in a way not 100% that China is watching. China is watching closely how Putin has been testing the red lines, the stature, the resilience of the West. So it's the result of what's going on is important not only for Russia. In Washington and mainly in Brussels, the sense of Russia is the sense of declining power. Of course, it's not from today till tomorrow, but demographically, it's declining power. Economically, in many senses, declining power, but it makes Russia even more dangerous for Ukraine. And not only for Ukraine, for the Central Europe. So the point is to come up with a kind of different answer. And the point, and I like the U.S. call to China actually to tell Putin, now it's probably enough. Simply come down, and whether it would work, because I suspect there is a level of coordination between Russia and China. I don't believe it's a sort of common policy, but the level of coordination is there. So fundamentally, what I believe we need from the West is a sort of new approach. Well, if we have more of the same, it's not something which would prevent Putin from going ahead, because he needs something mind-blowing. He needs a new emotion. He has 100 years of the creation of the Soviet Union at the end of December. He has 2024, and he has Russia, how believes he had created it. So he needs to stabilize it in his way. Of course, he could do more on Belarus. He could do more in the south of Russia. And of course, he could cut Black Sea and Azov Sea. But at the end of the day, it would bring him a lot, but not what he wants. And my message, if you like, to everybody, let's start thinking in a kind of different pattern, going beyond more of the same. It's just critically important now. Otherwise, Putin could use his ability to rule Russia like that, and then fundamentally to find a moment to strike. And it would be a fundamental problem for Ukraine, as you clearly understand, but also a fundamental problem for the West, for the Western image and for the Western ability to say, okay, we're still serious folks in this world. So it's really a lot at stake. For us, clearly, it's our existence. But for the West, it's probably Western ability to play on the same level with China. It's really how I see it.
Thanks very much, and I think your intervention reminded me that saying where you doing the same things, trying to achieve an opposite result is the definition of insanity, right? So I think let's remember that just replicating what didn't really work to stop Putin in 2014, other than it was resolve of Ukrainian armed forces and population to resist. Western strategy was quite feeble. It's an interesting question and brings me back to General Hodges, whether US and NATO has such ambition that, Pavlo was talking about, to be more proactive on Russia, because I think there was a certain detente, between Russia and the West saying non-interference, sovereign rights. We are not really talking much about human rights, but, we're trading and doing business with Russia, because hopefully through trade, Russia will become a democracy over time. That strategy clearly led us to nowhere. So is there ambition? Could there be, is this Biden doctrine? What is in it? And what concrete steps, I think, especially countries like United States, because it's clearly the whole confrontation is targeting White House to a large degree. So what do you think?
Well, first of all, the idea that somehow anything that we do legitimately provokes the Kremlin to action, of course, is another part of the fairy tale. Russia's attack on Georgia and then their invasion of Ukraine all happened after we, the United States, UK, Germany, Netherlands, had basically disarmed ourselves in Europe. So when we were at our weakest is when they attacked. And if you think about the number of American soldiers that are in Europe, all of Europe, it would not fill up the stadium where Lokomotiv plays football. I mean, there's just, so the idea that somehow we are a threat, of course, is a fairy tale, and that we provoke them is a fairy tale. And we should act like we do have the combined economic and diplomatic power of 35 nations of the EU and NATO plus partners. Use that power, the combined diplomatic and economic power backed up by military, and not be so afraid of the bully. Now, you asked at the beginning, I think, why does this matter for Europe? Why does it matter for the United States? Obviously, what we're talking about, the entire international order of stability and security that has given prosperity to millions and millions of people for the last many years since the end of the war. That's what's at stake here. If we do not successfully stop President Putin's ambitions here, then it's only going to be more. If you think about what we're seeing now is a continuation of what started in 2008. They haven't backed away from anything. They've only stair-stepped increasingly what they have and continue to move forward. So it's time to stop that, or otherwise it will continue on. There is no limit, I think, to what they would want to do. And of course, there's a practical aspect to this. Refugees, there will be hundreds of thousands potentially of refugees going into Poland, especially, but not only Poland. And of course, this would not be an accident of collateral damage. The Kremlin knows full well the impact it had when they supported the Assad regime in Syria. Over 3 million refugees headed directly into Turkey and onward into Europe, and the impact that had on European society, the impact it had on UK. And so that's why they ran a sequel to that in Belarus, with these thousands of tragic figures being brought in from the Middle East and then used as to put pressure on the EU and specifically on our allies in Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. So I think this is part of the plan as well. Now, the idea of being proactive is something that I have longed for. You know, we're so reluctant and worried about provoking that we yield the initiative all the time. And you know, one of the principles of war is the initiative. Instead, we sit back on our heels and then react to whatever the Kremlin does. And of course, they know that. So it's time for us to figure out how do we take the initiative, but do it in a way that doesn't shatter the unity of the alliance. Pavlo's right. Not every country, not every country is in favor of an aggressive approach. Clearly, Ukraine is not an island, but we treat it like it's an island. When Americans hear Ukraine, they think Giuliani or Trump or some outrageous things like this. Instead, Ukraine is it's on the map. That's why it's so strategically important. It's where Ukraine sits on the map in the Black Sea region. And I think our leaders, our parliaments and Congress and our populations need to understand why the Black Sea matters. And then you can understand why Ukraine matters. The Black Sea region, of course, it's a buffer against Iran. It's a buffer against Islamic extremism. It has incredible economic potential that needs to be exploited. That's the last thing the Kremlin wants. They don't want a bunch of Europeans and Americans starting to invest in the Black Sea region and paying attention to why are there Russian troops in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia? Why are they in Transnistria? Why are they in Ukraine? That's why they don't want the economic investment. And then, of course, the Black Sea is the launching pad for Russia for everything that they do, not just in the Black Sea region, but into Syria, into Africa. This is why the Black Sea matters. This is why Ukraine is so strategically important. Finally, what really matters here also is that the Chinese Communist Party leadership is watching. And if they see that the United States, with all of our allies and all of the economic and diplomatic power of the European Union, cannot deter President Putin from what he's doing that is so obviously illegal, so obviously wrong, so obviously the aggressor. If we cannot deter him from doing that, then I think that the Chinese Communist Party leadership will not be too impressed by anything that we say about Taiwan or South China Sea.
Thank you very much, General. And maybe to Peter, I kind of modify a question a little bit with this seizing of the initiative, because part of the modern world is the narrative, right? Do you think in the media sense, in the narrative that Ukraine tells about this battle, we are seizing the initiative? And if not, what is missing from the picture?
I think Ukraine is more controlling the narrative, is doing more to take over the narrative, but not enough. I mean, I'm sure there's huge progress needs to be made still. I mean, the entire narrative that Russia proposes at the moment of NATO, the entire idea of the NATO threat through Ukraine and around Ukraine is bogus, is invented. It doesn't exist. There's no greater threat from NATO today than there was 8 years ago. There was no real threat 8 years ago. There was no threat today. The idea that there's a growing threat is nonsense. And the other great narrative that Russia is currently very actively promoting is the idea of the West and NATO and America collectively forcing Ukraine, somehow using Ukraine. Yeah, Putin yesterday again, he made this very explicitly. He explicitly made this claim and suggested that the West was using Ukraine, was exploiting Ukraine simply as a tool against Russia. So I think the key message from Ukraine, and it's something that I try to do, but I think it's something that we can all promote as an idea, is simply the idea of Ukrainian agency. And this idea is very often underestimated. And, you know, frankly speaking, as someone who works in the English language sphere about Ukraine and often to promote Ukrainian narratives, I'm well aware of the fact that the West has not been very, very proactive in its support for Ukraine. There are very many people in the West who would much rather Ukraine was not an issue. Ukraine was back in the Russian sphere of influence, and things would be much, much easier. Things would be much simpler, frankly speaking. So the impulse of the situation we find ourselves in today is very much from Ukraine. The Euromaidan, the genesis of all this, was a very much Ukrainian-driven popular uprising, going back even further. The Orange Revolution, the same story again. The West was very slow to react and was not overwhelmingly supportive. And after the Orange Revolution, the Western support for Ukraine was really inadequate, frankly speaking. But Russia tries to present that as a Western plot. In actual fact, the West was very modest in its backing and was very unenthusiastic afterwards about embracing Ukraine. You know, so these ideas of these attempts by Russia to repackage everything as a Western plot and Ukraine as the sort of hapless figure in the middle, being caught out and exploited and tricked, somehow misled, is understandable from a Russian point of view, because obviously Russia doesn't want to admit that Ukraine has rejected Russia, that Ukraine sees its future being within the Euro-Atlantic community. But it's false, it's bogus, and it needs to be called out as such. And we need to refocus attention on Ukrainian agency. The West has overlooked Ukraine many times historically, going back to even like the time of the Versailles Treaty in the early 20th century. To its cost, you know, that Ukraine was forced into the Soviet Union, and then it became a big issue there. We had the horrors of the Holodomor. Hitler then saw opportunities in the Soviet Union to claim Ukraine. That was one of the causes of the Second World War. Eventually, Ukraine's independence movement was a big factor in the split of the Soviet Union itself. So we mustn't underestimate Ukrainians. We mustn't underestimate the agency of Ukrainians. And I think that's an important message to try and bring the bigger narrative. Let's move beyond all these misleading talk about NATO expansion and Russian security concerns. And let's say this is all about Ukraine, fundamentally. It's all about the Ukrainian people. And they will have the last word, in my opinion. I'm very confident of that. But unless we push this narrative forward and promote this and secure the support Ukraine needs, that last word could be a long time, could be decades away. And that's a very tragic outcome that will have a huge opportunity costs for Ukrainians themselves, but also for the Western world, and arguably also for Russia itself, for Russian people. So let's move on with that and let's focus on the Ukrainian people themselves.
Well, thanks, Peter. I think it's interesting that I think it was Pavlo Klinkin who mentioned emotions in his introductory remarks about let's have an informed emotions. But this is the question: what kind of emotion Ukraine evokes in the West? Is it the feeling of burden, an obstacle to make money with Russia in some countries, or is it, you know, an added value in, instead of being a backyard of Russia, being actually a back door to the future Russia? And is there that emotion and that aspiration? I mean, I don't think it's a pure coincidence that Serhiy Plokhy called his book The Gate of Europe. Maybe he's read Mackinder and the importance of Eastern Europe as the gate of Eurasia. And this is exactly that gate that Putin is trying to shut, to divide the continent and to destabilize it, because where there's a chaos, he sees an opportunity clearly. But I would like to move on to a couple of questions from our audience. And one is particularly, I would like to actually address it to Pavlo Klimkin, that is related to Minsk agreements. Andriy Kaprotsky is asking, why doesn't Russia just fulfill its part of the Minsk agreements? And this could be a much cheaper way of destabilizing and bringing down Ukraine. Interesting proposition. I'm not sure how that could be, but maybe you, Pavlo, can speculate about it. And also, you mentioned that the Minsk agreements could be imposed on Ukraine and there would be consequences of that. So maybe you can also explain, if that is the case, what are the most risky parts of the Minsk agreement and what would be the consequences if they are imposed by, let's say, France and Germany, and perhaps supported by US, who knows?
I believe we have to reject Minsk arrangements officially, or better to say quasi-officially. And the best moment for that was actually at the beginning of Zelensky time as a president, with this overwhelming support. It could have been easier, to have a real push. But he wanted to get a deal with Putin. He did basically nothing in raising the issue of massive passportization. And Putin signed this decree just on the eve of the inauguration. It was a very deliberate and very targeted provocation. Now we came back after 2 years, or better to say 2 years and a half, to the issues of double citizenship, of declaring double citizenship, of countering Russian passports issuance, but it basically the time almost over on that. We lost all these opportunities, and we need to take a kind of completely different strategy. And the only way is to have such a strategy with the Americans, also with the Europeans, and it should be part of this US-Russian agreement. Nobody can impose on us the Russian vision for the Minsk arrangements. It's simply not possible. Whether you like some bits of that or not, it's fundamentally does not matter. The Minsk arrangements won't work anymore. After basically Putin killed off these arrangements with his decree on passportization, after that with his decree on integrating Donbas economy into the Russia's one, after that saying, now social payments. At the end of the day, it's, how should I put it? At the end of the day, it's now creeping annexation of occupied Donbas. So we can't simply follow, we can't follow the logic of Minsk, whether the Russian logic or French-German logic, clusters. It's over. Because we need, there's a new special logic of transitional periods. We need international engagements here, and let's be realistic. It's not about peacekeepers, but it's about kind of international component overseeing what's going to be going on there. There is no other way to not to let Russia to use the occupied Donbass as a sort of Trojan horse, and of course no way how to put it into our constitution. We're fundamentally against it. Well, of course we can play with the issues of the border control, because we discussed many times international border control, and for me it would be the best way. And it's not in any way prohibited by the Minsk agreement. So there is a lot of speculations around the Minsk agreement. The first one or the second part, which is more famous in a way. But I don't see any, and I really mean it, I don't see any reasonable chance for realizing the Minsk arrangements as such. It's over. We need to come to something completely new, and it should be part of the deal between the US, EU on one side, and Russia on the other side. Why I have not mentioned Ukraine? Of course, we should be part of this deal on the Western side. Unfortunately, our influence here is really marginal because now everything depends on US-Russia negotiations. So fundamentally, the only way to de-escalate is simply to come up with something new. It's the same logic, like more of the same. If we follow more of the same with the Minsk agreement, we are pretty much nowhere. It's probably not the most popular view in the West, because this mantra of the Minsk arrangements is so so entrenched. But you know, it does not make sense anymore. It's over in the sense of any sense and any chance of being implemented, being realized under current realities. How I see.
So it almost sounds like we need to revive some of the ideas that I remember you promoted under President Poroshenko with the UN peacekeeping mission, and there were some serious even studies done what this mission may look like, and number of people that have to be deployed, almost like the new Kiev road to peace, how Ukraine sees the steps out of this stalemate or even possible escalation, because who knows how Kremlin will currently play out these temporarily occupied territories in the upcoming weeks, honestly. But definitely Putin is making everything to make this reintegration unsafe as possible. At the time when Kiev talks about safe reintegration, Putin does everything to make it unsafe for the future reconciliation when Kiev takes over these territories and people there. So I see Paul wanted to contribute something on Minsk. I've seen your hand.
Thanks, Orysia. Yes, I did want to just take off from where Pavlo ended relating to the whole Minsk agreement and relating to specifically Ukraine's geopolitical trajectory. And there's been a lot of speculation over the last couple of weeks that Ukraine's Western allies are pressuring or probing President Zelensky to see how far he's prepared to go, or how far Ukraine is prepared to go in terms of potential concessions. And so here's the thing that we have to be very concerned about, and that is, will Ukraine be strong-armed by its allies into concessions that would undermine Ukraine's geopolitical trajectory? We've heard things like, you know, taking NATO and EU out of the constitution, holding elections in the Donbass to speak to Minsk. And that's a big concern that we have. And I think it's really important for the international community to do very publicly, is to stand behind President Zelensky to highlight what are those red lines and green lanes. And we continue to do that as the global diaspora, as to say, here are our red lines and here are our green lanes, that we make it very clear to President Zelensky. And that also he should know that we have his support, that he has our support and the international community's support, that that he will not be strong-armed into concessions on Ukraine. And we have to also continue to highlight that Ukraine is the victim of a unprovoked and brutal assault. And we, Ukraine, should not be asked to make concessions to our assailant here. And so that's, I think, really, really important for us to emphasize here, is that we are not going to strong arm Ukraine into changing its geopolitical trajectory.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's also a question from Nina Sakun that is about Zelensky's denial that Putin is posing a danger. I mean, I guess this is an interpretation of what he said, but Nina has a feeling that Zelensky is kind of taking Putin's side. And how significant is that? What is the risk of that? And you know, really, what are his motives? So maybe Pavlo, since you are in Kiev, how is that? What are the risks of miscalculation in strategic communication, if you want?
Well, we have a kind of, if you have an analogy on sport, giant slalom on messaging. Sometimes it's about no threat at all. Sometimes it's about taking up Kharkiv. Sometimes it's about not panicking. Sometimes it's about getting 100,000 more troops in 3 years, which is for many people kind of enigmatic because to answer the Russian threat with putting more people in our army and not in a symmetric way, it's really enigmatic for me. But fundamentally, it's the message in Kiev was just on two opposite paths. Partly, business as usual, and partly panicking, not panicking. So nothing coming out of these two simple narratives, and it's actually a sort of interwiding this narratives. So kind of funny. And I clearly understand Zelensky's desire not to compromise our economy because the pressure is there, and it's one of the most important hybrid challenges. But it's also a fundamental problem not to have a real narrative. If you ask Ukrainians, some people fear, some people don't fear. Some people go to territorial defense. Some people are ready to flee. It's basically contributing to this, how should I say it, fragmentation in our society, and it's what I find really damaging. We need to repair it. We need to fix it as soon as possible. So it's something like something of that, something of that, something of this cake, something of so it's not a real menu. It's not something which fits one into another. In recent days, I see some positive changes. Very, how should I say it, modest but visible changes in messaging. Maybe it's about our partners, maybe it's about common sense coming on Bankova. I don't know. Maybe it's a mixture, probably at the end of the day. But I would say it's getting slightly better. Hopefully, it's not too late.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think speaking of the time of anxiety and crisis, this is exactly where this word leadership comes with a lead, right? I mean, a nation expects leading guidance about where each citizen, and I think there's quite high readiness of citizens to contribute, be it voluntary support to the army, be it just educating teachers in case of crisis emergencies. And I see civil society, as it was in 2014, is not waiting so much for instructions from the top down. And honestly, I think this is the flip side of low trust societies, where citizens don't trust too much and take action because they know when crisis hits them, they will be the one that will have to take care of their communities, families, and cities. That's one of Ukraine's perhaps strengths. But I wanted to come back to General Hodges, because what Pavlo said about the increase of the buildup of Ukraine's armed forces with the increase of I believe it was yesterday, President Zelensky signed a decree to add 100,000 more servicemen and women to Ukrainian army. It seems, and he also spoke a lot that Ukraine has to rely on its own, has to, almost like this was the main message. Yes, there's the West there to help, but Ukraine has to build its own capabilities, capacities to defend Ukraine. And in view of the fact that there's no security umbrella for Ukraine, it seems like Ukraine, you can say militarizes. Ukraine is building its own military to protect its own country. Is that the path forward? If, NATO membership is somewhere, in the long-term perspective, who knows if it will happen? Ukraine is building these smaller alliances that help Ukraine to have an autonomy and capacity to protect. Is it a good strategy?
So I was impressed by the president's energy, or your president's energy on growing the size of Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, he was very clear about he had done the math with the general staff. They figured out what might be needed to deter a new Russian attack. And of course, he's thinking not just next month, but years to come, because I do subscribe that the situation we're in now is not going to go away. I mean, this is it for as far out as I can see. Just like in the Cold War, we're talking about 4 decades where, we were face to face. And I think that this is a real prospect. And so the president is correct. President Zelensky is correct to worry about impact on the economy. How do you have an economy that can sustain adequate defense to ensure Ukraine's protection? And to grow 100,000 troops over the next 3 years without conscription, that will be very expensive. I mean, let's be serious. I mean, the installations, the training, the recruiting, not to mention the expense. So this is quite a commitment. But I also think it's necessary. But Ukraine is not alone. I think it's noteworthy that President Zelensky has not asked for a single American soldier to come into Ukraine, not a single British or Polish or German soldier to come into Ukraine. He's not asking for that. He's asking for the tools with which Ukraine can defend itself. And of course, he's asking for the financial support necessary to grow Ukraine's armed forces, including improving its naval capability, which I would absolutely support. But Ukraine has neighbors. I mean, a powerful neighbor, Turkey. Romania is modernizing its forces very quickly, and it has real capability. And what I have never seen in the at least 10 years since I have begun paying close attention to the Black Sea region, I have not seen any cooperation between Black Sea nations. I mean, I'm sure it happens at different levels in different places, but I don't see it. And today in the U.S. Congress, almost every member of Congress could correctly identify Latvia on a map, Lithuania on a map. I am sure you would have a hard time finding any members of Congress that could find Moldova or, which one is Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. They just don't know, because we haven't focused on it as a region, but also the Black Sea nations do not put your voices together. The Baltic countries do. Those 3 small countries are extremely loud in Washington and in Brussels. Poland has a huge diaspora in the States, so everybody knows Poland. But you don't have that from the Black Sea nations. And I think raising awareness by putting your voices together, but also collaborating in terms of intelligence sharing, of pressuring, putting maritime resources together, and working with Turkey to be willing to take more of a decisive role. I think these things also would help with Ukrainian defense.
It's almost like what we're all suggesting today is that, yes, the crisis needs to be managed, the deterrence has to be in place, but we must remember this bigger picture. And that in a way will also give energy to think, in the way, because it's underpinned by hope that, regardless of what we do, this is the right, regardless of how actually it turns out, this is the right way forward, because we cannot control necessarily how things will turn out. But having a vision helps at the difficult, uncertain times like now to persevere on the path and not to give up. And I think because so much of this warfare is psychological, and one of our listeners was mentioning that reflexive control make the victim feels like it's an aggressor and give up, and other things. I think that's keeping that bigger picture in mind, it helps us all. So we have 5 minutes before we wrap up, and I really wanted to go back to the panel with one simple question, because also Ukrainian World Congress wants to run a bit of a social media awareness campaign about 5 steps to stop Putin now. So we talked quite a lot about the big picture. If you were to answer that question, think about Twitter hashtag format, what would you say one or two steps to stop Putin now? Maybe I'll go in reverse order, start with Peter.
Well, I have 5 steps. I mean, I think let me
You
give
can
one.
say one or two.
Let me say one.
Your favorite.
one.
Say
I mean,
your
I think
favorite.
it's got to be arm Ukraine. It's got to be arm Ukraine. Get Ukraine the defensive weapons they need. They're more than capable of using them. The Russians know that. The Russians don't like it when Ukraine is armed. They react very negatively, which is a very encouraging response. If I could be more specific, I would say at this point, anti-aircraft weaponry technologies, anti-aircraft capabilities of all kinds are desperately needed, because that is the real weak link that I hear mentioned again and again in Kiev. People are concerned that Ukraine cannot contain Russia in the air whereas on the ground, I think people are far more confident. So let's arm Ukraine and let's get the anti-aircraft capabilities up to a level that will make Russia think twice.
Thanks, Peter. And I hope, General, that Peter didn't steal your thunder on the steps talking about arming Ukraine as a journalist. So what would you say?
So Germany has to step forward. Germany is the key to having meaningful diplomatic and economic pressure. Without Germany, I think the Kremlin believes that they can ride out American-only sanctions. But if Germany's involved and other countries come along, I think that makes a huge difference. So we've got to get Germany to act more decisively. And the other thing, internal, Ukrainian political leaders have got to come together. It is very, very hard to watch for all the friends of Ukraine to watch while this is all going around, the terrible domestic political fighting that's happening. I understand it. Look, I'm from the United States. Our own domestic situation is so bad over the past several years. It hurts me physically, but we're not about to be attacked by Russia. Ukraine is, and I think leaders have got to put political things aside. I'm not naive, but I mean, I think people need to come together and say this is about protecting our country. Otherwise, there'll be no country to argue about in the coming years.
Thanks, General. And you've got some thumbs up on that, and also people saying stop Nord Stream 2 and sanction Putin now. These are some of the ideas coming from the audience. Pavlo.
The only way is to explain, or better to say, to get over this feeling that it's not Ukrainian war. It's the threat is there. And, you know, if Ukraine is under threat, everybody could be under threat, and the real threat, not just token exercise. It's how I believe it's the only way to address it. I don't see anything else, really.
Thank you, Pavlo, and over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Orysia. I agree with the earlier comments. The one thing I will add to this is we need to prep the international community for a limited Russian invasion. I think General Hodges spoke to that very eloquently, that they see that as a weakness, and also to prepare the international community for the disinformation campaign that will pursue. We should learn from our experience, the little green men, the Russian operatives that engineer fake separatist movements. So, you know, these false narratives of protecting Russian speakers. I think we just need to prepare the international community for that. And so what's really key is that the allies need to be definitive that 1 meter of territory invaded, occupied will trigger the full might of international sanctions. So my call would be something along the lines of 1 meter of territory, 1 death is 1 too many and will not be tolerated. And I think the international community needs to be very clear and definitive on that.
Thank you so much. If I may add my ideas, I think it's key to keep the unity. And I think that's why US engagement is key here, because this is targeted, you know, to a certain degree against the United States directly as a challenger, you know, as a disruptor. And I think Russia has never really won against the United West, and especially of course, Russia has some cushion to sustain for a while, but if General was talking for a confrontation that is coming up within the lifespan, of a generation, basically, that means that they have to be very careful at what kind of confrontation they're getting themselves bogged down to. And I think, one of the key messages from Western capitals to Putin also should be that Ukraine is core to our interest as much as it is core to your interest, because Putin's bluff is, of course, that Ukraine is more dear and more geostrategically important to Russia than it is to the West. And I think if Putin here is from Berlin, from Paris, from Washington, then I think he'll pay attention. And if China, it's very interesting to watch how China will play out, whether they will consider legitimate security concerns, and how much they will push that from their side. But it has been a terrific seminar, and I think it shows that Ukraine is a real global nation. This is what we are. All those Ukrainians peppered around the globe can contribute. And I think that's what Ukrainian World Congress is good at, is mobilizing energy of Ukrainians abroad. And I personally think that solidarity with Ukrainians, like last weekend, there was a campaign in Leeds, for example, where my son is actually a student, and the main square of Leeds, there were Ukrainians saying, protect Ukraine. This all is like a drop in the ocean, if many of you remember the slogans of Euromaidan, but it makes a difference. And I think Ukraine World Congress really makes a difference. You make a difference, and let's all keep at it, because it's a long run. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So I wish all of you well. Thank you very much, our speakers today, for taking time, contributing your insight. It's been terrific discussion. I hope Ukrainian World Congress has a lot of good ideas to pursue, and have the rest good of your day, morning or evening, depending on wherever you are on the hemisphere. Thank you so much for having us. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.